Yes, there was a moment in 1988 when an airplane lost part of its roof at a dizzying altitude of over 7 kilometers. The passengers suddenly had nothing above their heads, and it quickly became very dramatic. We'll show you exactly how it turned out, and what incredible scenes followed in a moment. In this video, you can expect several crazy stories that happened on airplanes. Among other things, a plane crash, a plane that took off but never landed, and many other incredible things. So it will be turbulent. That's why we're starting immediately. We start our video with an airplane moment that you wouldn't even wish on your worst enemy. When 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke boarded an airplane in Peru with her mother on Christmas Eve in 1971. She just wanted to visit her father and had no idea what was about to happen that day. At first, the scheduled flight went quite usually, but then the plane got caught in a strong thunderstorm and was even struck by lightning. Then, in midair, the plane broke up, and Juliane, who fortunately was wearing a seatbelt, fell from an altitude of 3,000 meters with her seat into the jungle, where she first hit the canopy of the trees, some of which was 100 meters high, and then slowly fell to the ground. Miraculously, the girl woke up about 20 hours after the fall in the middle of the jungle. Although she had numerous injuries and was only a teenager, she knew exactly what to do. Namely, Juliane, who already had experience with the jungle, knew that along rivers there was the highest probability of meeting people, and so she hiked and swam along a river for an incredible 10 days until forest workers finally rescued her. Juliane's case was later made into a documentary film by the well-known director Werner Herzog, and even today, the now 68-year-old woman, who later studied biology, regularly returns to the Peruvian jungle, where she has been running a research station for over 20 years. After Juliane's involuntary fall from the sky, we now continue with a man who intentionally jumped out of an airplane from an altitude of 3 kilometers and whose fall is still one of the most mysterious aviation incidents 50 years later. But let's take it one step at a time. On November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man calling himself Dan Cooper checked into Portland in the United States. The unassuming gentleman took a plane bound for Seattle and was dressed like a businessman in a suit, shirt, and tie. So the stewardess didn't think anything terrible when he first slipped her a note shortly after takeoff while ordering drinks. But when she read it, she turned pale. Dan Cooper had written on it that he had a bomb in his briefcase and would bring the plane down if his demands were not met. To prevent the worst from happening, the pilot landed in Seattle, where Dan Cooper was handed $200,000 and 4 parachutes, as he requested. Cooper then forced the pilot to fly slowly toward Mexico with his landing gear down. Then, after about 20 minutes of flight, the pilot saw that the rear aircraft door had been opened, and Dan Cooper had disappeared without a trace. He must have jumped in the middle of the night in the rain and high winds, which is considered almost impossible to survive even for experienced skydivers. Although the police and even the FBI immediately launched an elaborate search operation, Dan Cooper would remain missing forever. The only thing that could be found were a few bundles of ransom money, which a little boy accidentally discovered while playing by the river. The FBI investigated the case for 45 years until they finally gave up, making it the only unsolved hijacking in American history. After this mysterious case, we now come to a situation we mentioned at the beginning of the video. Aloha Airlines Flight 243 was just 20 minutes in the air in 1988 when it suddenly happened. After the takeoff and the climb went without problems, the plane was just at an altitude of 7,300 meters. Suddenly, a small part of the upper fuselage tore without warning. The crack grew rapidly within a very short time, and finally, the entire cabin ceiling tore in. All 89 passengers were suddenly sitting without a roof at an altitude of over 7 kilometers. A stewardess was pulled out of the plane by the air suction, and the passengers could cling to their seats to avoid being sucked out of the plane themselves. The fact that the emergency oxygen supply was no longer working made the situation even more explosive. Fortunately, the pilot kept his nerve and did the right thing in this terrible situation. And so he managed to make an emergency landing on the plane only 10 minutes later at a nearby airport, thus saving the lives of everyone on board. Apart from the stewardess, who was sucked out of the plane and could never be found, everyone involved escaped. Later investigations showed that the aircraft ceiling had not been adequately taped and that the material had become weaker and weaker due to saltwater penetration. until it finally tore off entirely during the disaster. Due to the incident, aircraft maintenance checks were tightened considerably, and many older aircraft were even taken out of service altogether. After all these dramatic stories, we now continue with an airplane moment that is simply fabulous. Anyone who has ever flown and spent many hours between screaming children has probably wished to travel like celebrities alone in a private jet. That's exactly what happened to Steven Schneider from the US by chance a few years ago. When he arrived at the airport, a stewardess at the counter told him that all the other passengers on his flight had been rebooked on earlier flights. But unfortunately, Steven was the only one who couldn't be reached because the phone number he had given needed to be corrected by mistake. And so he was given the choice of taking a later flight or being the only passenger. Unfortunately, Steven first had a bad conscience and did not want to be responsible for an entire plane taking off with only him as a guest. But when he was told that the plane would otherwise fly empty anyway, the American accepted the offer. And so Steve experienced the flight of his life. All alone on board a huge passenger plane, he had peace and space without end, and the entire board staff cared only for him. And so Steve could enjoy the luxury of a private jet at the price of a normal scheduled flight. While Steve was the only passenger to enjoy the staff's full attention and fulfill all his wishes, the boarding crew completely neglected a woman in Ukraine 2 years ago. On her flight from Turkey to Kyiv, she had complained several times that she was too hot. Since the airplane crew could not help her with her heat problem, however, the woman decided after the landing finally to take the thing into her own hands. Namely, the mother of two opened the emergency exit and then went for a walk on the plane's wing to get some air, as she said herself. The video of this bizarre incident went viral, and the woman ended up on the airline's blacklist for her dangerous behavior, which means she will never be allowed to board one of its planes again. After this already really crazy incident, we end our video with an airplane moment that is even crazier and actually also seems completely impossible, but so happened. In 2015, a British Airways plane from London to Dubai had to turn around after only 30 minutes in the air. The official reason was an abort for health and safety reasons. Also, to check out, hundreds of passengers had to wait for the next flight for 15 hours, and the airline provided food and accommodation for the angry passengers. But what exactly led to this situation? Just pause the video now and write us in the comments what you suspect. One thing in advance: it is curious. Finished? Then let's solve it now. The plane had to turn back because a guest had done his business in the aircraft toilet. This created such an acrid and foul stench that it filled the entire plane and made it unacceptable for passengers and crew to continue the flight. By the way, who was responsible for this foul-smelling incident, which led to the flight being canceled and delayed for 15 hours, was never clarified. If you found this video about violent flight stories interesting, be sure also to check out our video about flight secrets passengers aren't supposed to know. Otherwise, take care, and we'll see you next time here at Wisefool.